Welcome to the Living Springs Q&A podcast, where your questions are answered live every week by the pastors of Living Springs. Thanks for tuning in.
Hey, watchers and listeners.
How's everybody doing today? Sorry, guys. Welcome to the Q&A podcast.
Well, I figured I'd jump in instead of leave it awkward there. That might have been fun.
I was reading the first question, so yes.
Though, Blake, I was, if I jumped in and said, hey, my expectation of you then is finger guns.
Finger guns, I'm sorry. I missed it.
If I
maybe next week.
Maybe next week. Stay tuned next week. I'm going to be away next week, so somebody may have to fill the finger gun
Finger
slot.
guns coming on.
Love it. Well,
right
I
on.
won't take your job the rest of the time.
All right, so it's Kyle and I today. No Doug, but we got some questions, so why don't we jump in?
Though I will say right off the gate, we need more.
Yes.
So
true.
If you don't listen all the way through to the end, that's normally when we make the plug. It's, hey, we've answered some. So if you're listening now, send in questions because we are running real tight. So send them in.
That would be good. All right, here we go. First question says this. At what point are we drawing unnecessary lines or setting unrealistic boundaries and expectations of our spiritual leaders? I clearly understand and fully support spiritual leaders stepping down for things like sexual misconduct. When looking at cases like Matt Chandler, however, if he did indeed just have a friendship crossing familiarity lines, should he have been forced to step down? Doesn't this reignite an antiquated argument that men and women cannot be friends? I do understand we may not have the entire story here, but if we do, then what does this say?
This is an awesome question. To be honest, I've been anticipating we'd have one earlier than we did, just with the news of one more story of another mega pastor needing to step aside from the role, albeit with Matt Chandler. It's a temporary one and seems to be a different note than some of the stories we've had. And I'm, in one respect, thankful for that. Mm-hmm. We've had a lot of sexual abuse and scandal that way. This one, thus far, has not lent itself that way, which makes it a better scenario than some.
Yes.
But there's lots of good to this question. I'll start by saying, and Blake, you can correct me if I'm wrong, biblically there seems to be a higher standard for leaders.
Absolutely.
And those who are affiliated with God and his name. And so in the New Testament that translates to the leaders of the church in the same way that it held to Israel in the Old Testament, that they were held more highly responsible for the way they lived because they were associated with God, and therefore same in the New Testament for leaders. So I wouldn't say that we shouldn't have higher standards for leaders as is. I'm a big believer in that. I think that's a part of the cost of stepping into leadership is that you have to lead people from all different areas. To step aside from this conversation for a moment, I know there may be some misconduct in an environment. When I was serving in Mission, BC, now, as a POC church, this was kind of off the table, but I got into conversations around it, around alcohol for pastors in that context. And in Mission, there was a higher rate of people using substances and abusing them. And so in that context, especially whether your denomination allows it or not, I think giving up of alcohol as the leader to those people was a wise thing. Even though it wasn't a standard that was needed for the gospel per se, it was one that would be needed to lead your people for where they were. With that said, then I think there are higher standards the leader may not need for themselves that they must submit to many times for the context in which they're leading. And so I will say this. We're always, as humans and as organizations with humans involved, we are not going to do this perfectly. So some places are going to have too high of standards, and some places are going to react to that and not have high enough standards. I can stop if you want to jump in.
No, good.
Okay.
You're doing good.
The issue I find is trying to universalize standards in a lot of places, because I feel like what happens then is this willingness to follow the letter of the law instead of the heart change.
Yeah.
So I've watched within the POC, speaking of my own upbringing and what my familiar context, is there are a lot of people who have the idea of just not touching alcohol as the issue that they say, check, got that done. But two, don't examine what they're putting into their bodies. And I was there myself. I really struggled with what I ate and looking at my health, but I could check I did the thing that I was supposed to do with consumption. And so I also don't think all the boundaries being universalized and set into a checkbox is necessarily the answer either. So it's this tough tension of how do you create actual heart change versus have good standards, but also good standards are good practice to call people to, but has to be done out of relationship, out of sake of reaching and leading people, not just out of here's a standard for holiness. It's a tough tension.
Yeah, I'd jump in there and say this has always been my thought for the last few years anyways, coming from a lens of like church discipline specifically, because that's kind of the context or experience I have.
Yeah.
Would say that if you just make business-like decisions,
Yep.
and we always do this when an organization of any type, but a church too, gets big enough that it's like, well, we don't have time for relational decisions anymore.
Yeah.
So now we will have a book or we'll write down some policy,
Yeah.
and the policy trumps.
Yeah.
Once you hit that, yeah, it's impersonal.
Yeah.
And there's no way to know whether, a situation is really that bad, or if there's some circumstances to it that would, soften our opinions about it. It just makes it black and white.
Yeah.
And yeah, then one size does not fit all, in my opinion, at all.
Yeah.
So the only way to have what you're talking about is have an organization small enough that I know you know me, there's accountability, and we can work within that.
Yeah.
But that's imperfect too, because I'm going to have a bias and feel, really sympathetic to your cause, maybe, Kyle, and then Laura's sitting behind the camera and she's like, I don't like Kyle at all, so he's going down, right? Like that happens in relationship too.
Yeah.
So as you said already, that's always going to be messy. This case in particular, I didn't know a whole lot about, but you were explaining it to me this morning, and in your explanation, it sounds like to me there's kind of two scenarios here. Either Matt Chandler stepped down because his organization said you should do this.
Yeah.
And then he would submit to the authority and say, okay, if someone's feeling uncomfortable with this relationship that he had, then obviously for the peace and good of my church or my family or whoever this is, then I will step out. And I think I would commend him. If that's what happened, I would say I commend him highly on that. The other situation is maybe, I don't know if got caught is the right word, but someone confronted him and said, hey, is this what I think it is? And he could say, yeah, it feels weird. Yeah. Then I would also commend him for doing what he's done.
Yeah.
So either way, I'm commending Matt Chandler from the information I have currently. But I would say both those scenarios line up with what you're saying about a leader having a higher expectation. We are accountable to people. Yeah. So if someone comes and says to me, Blake, this scenario looks awkward or looks bad, I need to consider that. Yeah. Right? To just say, no, it's nothing, isn't necessarily nothing if someone perceives it is. Yeah. So there needs to be some explanation or something to, again, appease whoever's coming forward saying, I don't feel this is good. Yeah. You have to put them at ease, right? And sometimes you can't. I mean, some people are just evil and want to take you down, so they're going to, say all sorts of slander against you, right? But if it's, somebody or some buddies that have a legit, concern, then as a leader, you have to take that as valid and you have to consider it, right? Yeah. Whether you think so or not. Yeah. And then we've talked about, I know on other podcast, like just as a pastor or a person knowing my own self, so I don't know what the case is here, but I think there is accountability there that has to happen.
Yeah.
And it sounds like in this situation it did. So that would be my first answer to kind of the first part of that question.
No, that's fair. I agree with that in an abstract sense.
Yeah.
Yes, there may be times when we draw these lines that leaders have to hold to high standards. I guess stepping into the specifics of this scenario, I disagree. I think this one overreached a little bit too far.
Okay.
I think you've hit two possible scenarios. I think so. I would kind of bring those in together, but then look at one is maybe the standard was too high, which is what this questioner is asking.
Yeah.
Or two, we may not have the full picture. Are the other two possible scenarios. Now, I will, again, give credit. I have a lot of respect for Matt Chandler, though I greatly disagree with him on a lot of things. And I look at him as a part of the reform movement, the complementarian movement, that they're going to have higher standards for the relationships between males and females in leadership, I think, just by default, whether right or wrong, in that environment. So I can't necessarily speak to it there coming from an egalitarian position in the same way. So I want to give recognition there. But one of the things that I have seen has been a detriment, and I'm not, I have to paint with broad brushes. I don't mean to do this, but just watching and reading in complementarian circles, there tends to be a lot more distance and therefore misunderstanding between males and females in those environments. And I think that's bled into a lot of even egalitarian organizations. This is a conversation we had this morning too, of the lack of friendship across those divides. I think can lead to some massive losses for the church of males understanding female perspective. And one of the things I've noted as well, just men's sometimes struggle with lust and objectifying women can often be undone by being able to have relationships and friendships with women, and all of a sudden that becomes something that I can value my female friends as people. And then so I think there's wholeness that comes from that. And so looking at this scenario and this particulars that I've been able to pull in from the announcement from Matt and from the board at their church was that they had a friendship and they're messaging on Instagram. Both their husband, Matt's wife and her husband knew about the friendship. But they were messaging too frequently, seemed to be the context in which he was asked to step down. And so, again, I can't speak from the outside of what that level is, but again, anecdotally making some assumptions into the scenario, I feel like that line sometimes has been set really, really probably too and unhealthily high in some church environments, even ones that I've grown up in, where I have had a lot of benefit from some of my relationships and friendships with females that my wife knows about, that my wife's a participant in, but there's also a level of independent friendship with those females. That we lose something in the body of united people when we draw those lines too clearly. And I feel like sometimes that has been done. Again, I am making some assumptions into this scenario. I can't speak to the specifics because they haven't been released. But if that's the case, I know there's certain environments where even some of my friendships may disqualify me when some of those relationships have been so valuable in helping me learn and hear and understand in an appropriate and accountable setting. But I think sometimes we have drawn that line too far. Again, we're never going to do this perfectly, and we've also seen the opposite in some egalitarian circles where that's been way over abused when there hasn't been enough of awareness.
Yeah, I was going to say, I like what you say, but I also, and I'm not challenging you about being naive, but I think we can be naive, and especially as Christians, we'd be really naive. We just assume that everybody's good and no one would ever do anything bad. You're a Christian, I'm a Christian. Yeah. Of course, it's going to work.
Totally.
History would suggest that doesn't work real well.
Yeah.
But I see a real danger there, and I think a lot of people do as well. Yeah. Divorce rate is high in Christian circles. Affairs, I don't know what the rate is. I've never checked into it, but from my perspective, I would say seem high for, in Christian circles. And I just think, I guess the question at the end there is interesting to me. Yeah. It says, doesn't this reignite an antiquated, I can't even say it.
Antiquated?
Antiquated argument. I had the wrong
All good.
emphasis
on the wrong syllable.
syllable. Yeah. Argument that men and women cannot be friends. I question that one a lot. Like I've told teenagers for a long time. I was a youth pastor, and I have 5 kids of my own that have all been teenagers now. And I would tell teenagers that boys and girls cannot be friends.
Right.
I just say that blankly, and this may get some AER out of somebody, but I'm like, I just don't see it. I think one or the other is always interested.
Right.
And the other one might be oblivious to it. Quite often I think they are. Like, we're just friends. Like, they don't like me at all. And you're like, really?
Fair.
But that's a scenario where neither is married or has a lot of life experience. So as an adult, I guess I would probably lower that line and say, yeah, I think men and women can be friends. But I would say there is a real danger to that at some point.
Sure.
I don't know where you draw that line, and I don't know, again, I'm not going to write a policy that makes it the same for every person.
Yeah.
But there is a line.
Right.
That where, and I don't think, especially in a Christian view, I will give Christians the benefit of the doubt. I don't think many of them get into a situation in a friendship with an opposite gender thinking it's going to go anywhere or problems are going to happen.
Right.
But at some point, especially in a marriage, I would say, where you're having a friend outside the marriage, if you're starting to spend time and share information outside your marriage with that other person, more so than you're spending with your spouse, it's going to lead to something that's not good.
Totally. I totally agree. I think we can universally agree on that line.
So then where is the line for men and women being friends? Because then on the other side, I agree with you totally and say, yes, we even talked about that this morning. How do we foster a culture even within our own church where men and women can learn from each other and can be friends and, have the benefit of another gender speaking into their life, right? Like, I think that's really good. But I just think, I understand why boundaries have been set.
Yep.
Totally. And that's to try and protect people. But then when I look at boundaries, I'm all over the place today, my rabbit trails. Boundaries, are typically set out of fear, right? I don't trust you, Kyle, so therefore I'll make a boundary for you.
Yep.
So that you don't have to, set it yourself, and I don't have to worry if you're being good or bad.
Exactly. And I think that's sometimes what we do with boundaries, right? Is we draw them too simply, and then we forget some of the costs that could be associated with them. Yeah. And we throw the baby out with the bathwater, quite literally, right? It is messier. Back to our talk of standards for leaders. We've sometimes thrown the baby out with the bathwater there and forget the cost of what drawing the line is actually doing there. Mm-hmm. And so, it's messier to be involved and personal about these and in relationship about how these standards get set. I would completely agree with you. Teenagers probably should not be friends outside of groups with the opposite gender. Mostly just pointing the finger at teenage boys, having been one at one point in my life, and having a daughter who I think will within 5 years be a teenager. Yeah, I go, yep. I just want you to avoid boys, period. Because I don't want you to be in a healthy relationship one day, but because I know the heart of the teenage boy. So I get there, but in adulthood and in maturity, and I think even for my kids getting to watch me. Being in friendships, again, it's got to be clear, and there's certain ones that I'm aware of, and again, there'd be boundaries that I even draw within those. Not going to spend any alone time in private with somebody of the opposite gender, but I think there is room to have friendships as long as there's accountability and awareness in those places, because I have benefited greatly. And I look at Scripture. Jesus would have gotten in a lot of trouble for his conversation with the woman at the well, and he seems to have shocked his friends, the disciples, when they walk up and approach, and he's sitting there chatting with this woman. You've got, I think, pretty clear relationship between Paul and Priscilla and Phoebe, where he had a massive level of trust with them, one equated to not quite to what Paul had with Timothy, but one enough to entrust the whole letter to the church in Rome to a female. You had to have had some deep friendship and closeness there to be able to do that. Mm-hmm. That I go, there's clearly, I think, a precedent in the New Testament for friendships. That doesn't mean there's not accountability. But things like the Billy Graham rule, again, have kind of swung to one side of the coin where it becomes dangerous, where we've seen, especially in egalitarian organizations, where this is even an option, females are not getting raised to levels of leadership at the same rate because they can't spend time with the boss, so they can't be seen for who they are and how they're leading, and therefore can't be entrusted with the roles. That's the natural fruit of throwing the baby out with the bathwater of, well, I can't meet with a woman, so I guess I'm going to keep taking all the guy pastors out for lunches and coffees, but sorry, can't meet. And so there's massive negatives there. And even I look at the POC again, like I don't want to, I want to clarify this quickly before I step into this comment. I'm thankful to be a part of the POC, but I think because of my love for it, I can critique from within the inside. So I know a lot of this comes out as negative. But I look around and I go, on paper, we're egalitarian. In practice, I think I have seen 2 churches that had co-lead pastors as women. I do not know of a POC church with a female lead pastor.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
And so clearly whatever system we're operating under, even though we're egalitarian by nature, we don't have the leadership there. And I wonder if part of it has come down to where we draw these boundaries. I'm not saying I have the solution or get rid of the boundaries, but has this Christian culture of keeping this divide so clear actually really hurt the church and its ability to hear from both sides and be the fullness of the body, even in a complementarian space? Have women a part of your committees, even if they're not leading, so you can have those voices. I don't know. These are the thoughts that ramble in my head.
Well, and it's an age-long thing. Like, it's not a new thing. As you were speaking, I just think of the patient ferment that we've mentioned many times on this podcast, you and I anyways.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's an example, like early church, like first 100 years of church history, where they weren't even, like, when they sent people out into a new community to evangelize in some way, they would never send a female to be with a male ever. And the males weren't allowed to stay with the females, just stay in their house, right? Like, they couldn't, go into a neighboring city and go, oh, you're a Christian family, I'll stay. No, you couldn't stay with a female. Yeah. So even in the first 100 years of Christian history, we have a tension of how do men and women relate to each other, right? And I don't think we're ever going to solve that issue. And there has been many abuses on both sides of that issue. Yep. So I think, again, this lines up in one of those ones where we have to hold it, in tension and go, okay, is the accountability there for people to have good friendships cross-gender in our church culture and with our leaders in a trusting environment where the accountability is there? Yeah. Because I think, I guess all that I would sum up and say, if we just make boundaries, that's not a good thing. Yeah.
And I was going to add to that then. I think we as leaders need to be seeking our own accountability, because no matter what accountability structures are out there, you can cut your way through them.
Oh, absolutely.
Easily. That leaders, the standard and the ownership really, I think, needs to be on ourselves to make sure to be open, to make sure to do all those things, because I've seen accountability structures all be skirted so easily for so long until the worst case scenario has finally come up, that I think we need to be seeking humbly accountability and openness at all times as we try to do this. And we're not going to do it perfectly.
And I would give props to you on your message this past weekend and say that's a total dying to self thing. Yeah. Right? Right. If I'm going to die to my selfish nature and live with Christ, then I'm going to welcome accountability into my life. Yep. Even if I'm not going to be able to get what I want or, have the freedoms that I think that I would, normally have, I want to welcome that accountability for the good of myself, for the good of my relationships, and the good as a spiritual leader of my church.
Totally. So totally. I want to leave it to rest, but there's just one more thing that I want to add that I recently came up on. Cool. Just to, I guess, back some of the things. John Wesley, as I came to be aware, he was complementarian by his theology, and it was the proximity of seeing women baptized and empowered by the Holy Spirit, and operating leadership gifts in their practical and actually doing it, that convinced him of the value of women in ministry before the theology had shifted.
That's cool.
As far as I have come to understand it. And so I go, again, giving space and room and relationship to observe, to see, to know, led, I think, back to that language that we've used a number of times from Acts 15 of it seemed good to us and to the Holy Spirit. Yeah. Right? You can almost put that, if that story holds up, if I'm remembering it correctly, that for him going, oh, this seems good to the Holy Spirit, and I guess to me too, right? Of seeing women empowered for that. And so again, we need to have proximity in order to empower one another. And so I think right now, the way the structures work, men are on the ownership of that. But again, doing that well and wisely, so we don't have more of these stories in the news, what actually are equally, maybe more so detrimental to the church than not having enough friendship with women. Like, again, the balance is a huge tension. But I just wanted to give that story out because I thought it was awesome.
Oh, that's cool. All right, we'll jump on to the next question.
Okay.
It does say you can save this question until it's more timely, but right now is the question we're answering. Is there a way to approach Halloween mindfully as a Christian, even if you don't pull out the old Ouija board? Is there a demonic presence to be aware of during the holiday? Can you enjoy free candy without enabling evil? Yes, I say yes. I don't know where you're going to go with this, but I say yes. Halloween's one of my favorite holidays. They give away free candy. Did anybody know this? You can just go to someone's door.
It's a lot creepier when you're your age, though, Blake.
Well, that's why I had children, and now I need grandkids. So at some point, my children need to get married and have grandkids and bring them to my house for Halloween so that I can walk around and steal candy out of their bags when they're not looking. But
I'll rent one of mine out for a good fee to people who have teenage and adult kids. That way they can still get their candy.
Perfect. I will take your kids trick-or-treating in a heartbeat, Kyle. I would love it. You get to put on a silly costume and then get candy. This is the best holiday they've ever come up with, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. Oh, man, that's awesome. No, I would fully agree. I will admit I don't have a great awareness of the evil presence and history of Halloween. I'm sure there is one. I've always been I've lumped it in now with all the boogeyman things that I heard of growing up from, not to say communism's good, but I'm going to, like, communism and Pokemon cards and rock music and Halloween. I'll just lump them all in the same thing of we've over-feared them. So as I've grown away from some of them and embraced some of them, then I am willing to look at this one. And so I think there's a history both within Christianity and outside of it of seeing things adapt and change over time that we then don't need to worry about that because we're no longer practicing it in its original sense. And maybe I'm really naive in that. There's a book by Leonard Sweet and Frank Viola, I think it was, called Pagan Christianity. And they listed like all the festivals that we have and a lot of the things we do in church actually have pagan roots. Yeah. Which was shocking to me. I kind of joke when I talk about that book, because they don't conclude on like, and this is how we move forward. They just kind of open Pandora's box and leave it open for somebody. So I've been really cautious who I recommend that book to. Like, I'm not going to hand that to a new Christian and be like, hey, here you go. But I look at that and go, I think then if we can see things redeemed from Christmas and Easter times of year when we celebrate them being redeemed and open, I think we can look at the heart by which we participate in something, and in that, at the very start, have an awareness that no, this is no longer an evil thing in most people's minds. It's an opportunity for free candy, and to be silly, to go about this holiday. And so I think there's a lot of joy. I see more community come alive and excitement in the neighborhoods.
Oh, Halloween's one of the biggest times of community we have in Airdrie anyway. So I'll just speak to Airdrie. This is where I live.
Yeah. And I heard a pastor once say this long ago. We spend 364 days a year talking about you need to go to your neighbors. You need to go to your neighbors and tell them about Jesus. Your neighbors are freaking coming to you on one day of the year, and we go, no, let's turn off the lights, close the doors, not participate in this. So I appreciated that pastor's candor in it of like, whoa, even if this were something, look at the opportunity that it's presenting. I grew up not being allowed to participate, and that rule changed the year that I was too old to participate. So I never got to go trick-or-treating, but my brothers did, which was devastating. So now I'm like that much more of an emphasis on making sure my kids get it because the bitterness that's in my heart. But no, I think it's completely safe for us to go and enjoy and then adding the caveat that I don't want to paint universal things on things that are secondary, tertiary, and Cole Hatchard actually sent me the word after last week. What's the fourth one? Quaternary or something like that? All right, cool. He knew it from biology. I'm butchering it now, but shout out to Cole there. So I'll have to look it back up. But if that's a conviction you have.
Absolutely.
And I'm saying this is okay, but you have a conviction otherwise. Listen to that over me.
Yeah.
My words are not written in red. And so if you've grown up, or if you have an awareness, or maybe there's been a dark experience you've had with Halloween, and the Spirit's going, no. Take some of the language from Corinthians 8, where Paul talks about meat offered to idols? I think it's 8. Where follow your convictions in that. So if you can't do that, do not let me sway you, and do what you need to do to listen to the Spirit in that leading. So,
yeah, you said the heart of it earlier, and yeah, I would completely agree. Interesting, you weren't allowed to. I was. So I think through. I have this conversation with a friend of mine quite often who's totally opposed to all these holidays because you mentioned pagan roots and all this, and he thinks that I've condemned my children to hell by allowing them to participate in Halloween. But I've said to him, and I'll say this on this podcast is my kids have no understanding that Halloween is linked to anything dark and negative or spiritual in any way. Yeah. And unless they've learned that, they've never seen it. They've never learned it from a church experience we've had. Yeah. They've never learned it in our home from myself or my wife. Yeah. So unless they're getting it from somewhere else, their experience of Halloween is what I described when I first answered this question: dress up and go door to door and get candy. Yeah. Now I'm a little bit more so. My parents allowed me to trick or treat, but we were never allowed to dress up as a devil. Right. That was the one caveat, right? So at least I had some understanding there might be some weird thing to this holiday, but I didn't really know what it was. Yeah. Now I would say there's lots of people beyond that who have a very real understanding of where Halloween comes from and the dark side of it and all that. Yeah. And for them, then do not participate in this. If that's you, don't participate in something that's wicked. That would be terrible. Totally. But I would say also, I'm not going to tell my children who are absolutely naive to that in any way whatsoever that they can't do this, because they wouldn't understand why not. They would have no understanding for that. Yeah. So unless you're going to teach them and convince them or whatever else. Yeah. And I don't see a need to convince people that Halloween's evil. Yeah. Just because it is to you. I just don't see the need to do that. I don't think they're sinning by going door to door and getting candy. Yeah. Unknowingly, or whatever. So I guess that's where I lie. And I understand that my friend, for sure, he's not listening to the podcast, but if he was, he'd be really mad at me right now and saying that I don't understand and I'm too naive and all the rest. But it's a heart thing. It's always a heart thing. Yeah. Where are we? Where is your heart, right? Yeah. If you're feeling this is icky, don't do it. Yeah. If you're feeling like God has given you freedom, then freely do that. And yes, always use the opportunity to love your neighbor as yourself. Yep. I mean, you don't have to thump them with Jesus. That can be weird too. I've seen Halloween people that, hand out, not giving you candy, but you can have this track, how to know Jesus in 4 easy steps. Yeah. I don't know if that's loving your neighbor. No. Right? No. But
I looked up my messages with Cole, and it's quarter. I'm going to make sure I get it right. Quaternary. So he texted me while I was on a run, and he just sent the one word, quaternary. I'm like, huh? He's like, oh, you were I'm just getting caught up on the podcast. But yeah, I agree. And I've to flip it on the other end, I've chatted with Christians. One gentleman in particular, one conversation sticking out in my mind, their family didn't celebrate Christmas. Whatever background of Christianity they came from, they saw the connection to some pagan holiday there, and so they chose not to participate in Christmas. And I felt no obligation to convince him to do so. Yeah. The church history has major divide over what week we should celebrate Easter. Should we continue to follow the Jewish calendar, or do we follow the Greek one? Well, we literally divided the church over that. So I think what a waste over such silly things versus realizing and finding what things we can agree on and moving forward and allowing our convictions to lead us there. And maybe there's more to be said. Maybe I'm being a bit naive, but...
Now I want to jump back. Yeah. Because you raised something that I'm curious about. So you said you read this book that most of our festivals are pagan in origin. Yeah. So
it's been a long time since I've read the book, so I may not remember it all well, but yeah, sorry, just want to caveat there.
I'm reading through the Old Testament right now. Just starting. So all these festivals are very new to me, or sorry, not new to me, but on my mind. God prescribes to the Israelites in the desert before they even enter into the promised land, 3 major festivals throughout the year. Yeah. would you know or say that those were pagan in origin, or is that those are God or
those ones are, as far as I know, those are God ordained. Those
Okay.
ones are like, no, these are for Israel. It's then when we get the amalgamation of Roman culture
Okay.
and all that in the New Testament with Christianity that there tends to be some overlap there, especially kind of like post-Constantine,
Yeah.
including Constantine,
Yeah.
of like trying to bring this whole empire together who's celebrating these other things and bringing in this new religion, Christianity, and how do we mix them? Well, you still celebrate on this day, but let's celebrate this one and tweak it over here to this Jesus guy. And so there was a lot of that once church and state are in bed, always a bad move. So that seems to be a much more, as far as I'm aware, exclusively Christian and New Testament thing, not an Old Testament one.
Okay, I assumed that, but I
Yeah.
wanted to ask that.
Yeah.
Because the podcast I was listening to in quite a while ago, and I wish I would have remembered the episode. I went back and tried to find it, and I can't remember it. He specifically talked about Christmas, and it was very interesting to me that I had the assumption that Christmas was definitely like a Constantine and after thing.
Yeah.
But there was definitely this guy that was leading this podcast. There's Christmas origins right from the birth of Christ.
Yeah.
And they would not have any pagan,
No.
pagan and festival to it. Now, I would say probably we've amalgamated in some way, and Constantine might have had a piece of that. But it was just interesting to me because I've heard many Christians tell me throughout the years that it is a pagan festival that the Christians grabbed.
Yeah.
And when I heard that history, I was like, oh, no, not necessarily, right? So
No, and I don't think it's an origin of, it's an amalgamation of.
Yeah.
Conflation, as I've been accused of using the word, so I may as well throw it in. So then, yes, I think there were Christians trying to celebrate that, and then you've got leadership in the government, Constantine and so on, who are trying to bring this nation together with this new Christian nation, so to speak, first Christian nationalism, I guess, and then go, let's compromise, let's take this holiday and put them together as one.
Yeah.
And so that's where it comes in, not the Christmas or the celebration of Christ's birth didn't enter before that, but that's where it became the merging of two.
Yeah.
Yep.
Very interesting. I will not try and say that Halloween is godly in any way. That definitely has been stolen by Christians or brought in by Christians. I would agree with them as far as my understanding on that problem.
There's a lot of language, too, that gets stolen from Christians in a really good way.
Yeah.
Right? Like the word gospel
Mm-hmm.
was not a Christian word,
Right.
and then was kind of taken and used as such. There are a number of words. I don't know all the history. There was Learning to Speak God from Scratch by Jonathan Merritt. He did a book that talked about the value of language in Christianity, and he mentioned a couple of these things, these words that were not Christian words by any means, but have now become like, that's a Christian thing.
Yeah.
And so I think there is a level of value in seeing things redeemed in the world. That is good. Not to say we're here to take over Halloween.
No.
Not necessarily, but I think there's room for seeing the value of it that way.
Cool. All right. Should we move on then?
I think so.
All right. In the Psalms, there's often discussion of the wicked. It seems easily read as there is a particular wicked person or group. Is it too presumptuous to assume that you are not that wicked person sometimes? Is that the humanity we need to bring to the Psalms, that we are all the wicked, at least in one way or another?
Great question. And I think you hit it at the end. If you read the Psalms all together, sometimes the psalmist, largely David, but there are definitely other ones in there, as we know, are sometimes speaking of the wicked out there, and sometimes he's just distraught over his own wickedness.
Yeah.
That there is both, for sure. And who I'm pointing out as the wicked group is often changing too, right? And so these guys are wicked for that, and those guys are wicked for that, and I'm wicked here for this, because we are all wicked and broken. But at different times and in the context of each psalm, there is often a wicked group that can be pointed at, and then the flip to the next one, and then the author is the wicked person themselves.
Yeah, awesome answer that, Kyle. I was going to say the same thing. I think the wicked, when it's a group or person out there, it's always associated with somebody, well, just non-Israelite.
Yeah.
Really, right?
Yep.
You could say non-God God follower, but that's not really true. It'd just be
Yeah.
David, for the most part, saying, you're not Israelites, so therefore you're wicked, right?
Yeah.
And I'm against you. But then there is a lot of personal Psalms where he would describe his own wickedness, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, I think the person who asked this question answered it themselves, in that this is the humanity that we need to bring to the Psalms, that we realize that in one way or another, our hearts are always being pulled away from God, and we need to deal with that.
Yeah, but I think included in the Psalms, and especially in the prophets too, though, I'll point out that the Bible, one of the most unique features of it is it records a history of its own people that are being highlighted as being the bad guys.
True.
Right?
Yes.
The Psalm, like sometimes David's frustrated with the rest of Israel. Sometimes, very often, the prophets are calling out their own people to go, you wicked generation, or whatever terminology they're using, you whore of a nation, like using tons of this language to point at themselves in self-awareness and judgment in a good way. That sometimes we need to see that brokenness internally before we can see it externally. Jesus, look at the log in your own eye before you worry about the speck in your brother's eye.
That's really interesting, because as you say that, without thinking too hard on it, I would say probably the Psalms, or David's writing, might be the most pointed out. Like, I would say most of the rest of the Old Testament is an inward focus.
Totally.
David's probably the only one who's calling out other people, saying you're terrible.
And the New Testament follows its category, right?
Yeah.
Mark, if you, as far as I've come to understand it the last few years, as I've spent some more time there, Mark is painting the disciples as terrible followers of Jesus, as like hey, don't do it like these guys.
Yeah.
That's the disciples. You see all of Acts copy all these blunders of the people there throughout it. All the Gospels really highlight the disciples failing in one way or another at different points. All of Paul's letters are calling out the church itself, or even sometimes owning his own mistakes, or calling out Peter or whatnot. That the New Testament carries on in that same idea of let's worry about ourselves more than the out group. And so the times when they're pointing out is actually more rare than those that are facing in. And I think, you can correct me if I'm wrong here too, more often than not, when somebody's pointing out at the wicked, it's actually in the moment of suffering and under persecution, more than like self-righteousness of look at us, we've got it all together, look at those wicked out there doing those despicable things.
No, it's usually persecution.
Right? Under like massive suffering. God, how long will you let the wicked go on?
Yeah.
Right? Looking at that group, something we in the Western world have no context of whatsoever as Christians. So the wicked the association of wicked is often under suffering. Interesting,
though, that the Israelites got that wrong.
Yeah.
The whole scriptures point inward.
Yeah.
And they were constantly pointing outward. Like it's everybody else's, they're the bad guys, right? Yeah. I'd say the best time in history is probably Christ, and immediately after, for the first couple of 100 years, the Christians seem to really get this. We should love other people, and then from there we close right back in, and we're 2,000 years later, saying everybody's wicked, and again, totally missing the point of God and what He's written in the Scriptures to us.
Oh yeah, well you make it to Acts 10 before you've got all these Gentiles can't join us here.
Yeah,
right. So I think that's human nature. It's a lot easier to work on my righteousness by painting everybody else as worse than actually deal with myself internally. Yeah. And I think this is what we're seeing in Christian culture wider right now. Maybe this is a conversation I don't want to breach, but I really think this is an issue we're seeing in Christian culture right now, that we're looking more at the wickedness of the world outside who does not know God than worrying about what's going on within ourselves.
Oh, yeah.
But
yeah, I agree.
So that's an age-old problem.
All right, next question.
Okay.
So who is the greatest of all time, the GOAT human in Christianity, and why?
Now, I know who sent this question. They said we were going to say Jesus. And to that I say, Jesus was Jewish, so we wouldn't answer him. Plus, Christianity is little Christ's. Christ can't be little Christ while being big Christ.
This is true.
So, off the table is Jesus.
Jesus cannot be the best human in Christianity. Okay.
And I would argue it would be hard to make any of the disciples that, because I think they'd be just as equally, if not more so, categorized as Jewish in that first generation. I mean,
can't Jewish be Christian though? Like, why are you separating there?
Well, no, you're right. Okay, I retract. That was the fastest recantation we've ever had. I recant. All right, so yes, they could be Messianic Jews. I guess is the terminology we'd use today. Okay, so then I'm going to answer this one. I'm going to go with, this should be of no surprise after if you've been listening to this podcast for any amount of time. I'm going to probably say Eugene Peterson.
Eugene Peterson.
Yep. Now this is going to be a real hot take. I've been having some struggles with Paul the last while as I'm reading his letters and stuff.
Really?
Like
Because
that.
I was going to say you're putting Eugene above Paul. Like Paul seems to me like, I wouldn't say Jesus for the reasons you just explained.
Yeah.
But I would have a hard time saying, and maybe this is based more on influence, so I'll let you answer in a second, but I would say influential Christian of all time.
Not saying most influential.
Okay, so greatest.
Yeah.
All right, so go ahead. Give me your Eugene Peterson take.
I guess maybe I'm also defaulting away from Paul because he's the easy answer because he's a biblical figure who wrote 2/3 of the books of the New Testament. Though, interestingly, did you know that Luke actually is the one who's contributed the most words to the New Testament, not Paul?
I did not know that.
Paul's got more letters. I think word for word, Luke has more writing. Anyways,
All right, good.
so there's that. I'm biased, I guess, in the same way that Paul would encourage, follow me as I follow Christ.
Yeah.
I have probably been brought more into the Bible, even into Paul's writings, by Eugene, and therefore I see him as one of the most influential and most Christ-like characters in my life because of how I've paid attention to him, how I've learned from him, having never met him, feeling like I get to sit at his feet so regularly and learn from him, that he points me to Jesus so regularly that I go, if I could be even a fraction of who Eugene is, I'd be on my way to being a fraction of who he sees himself to be, like Jesus. But I guess there's just a personal default in there that would make argument for him. There's some other incredible ones out there that I'm sure we could spend some time talking about, but he's just the one that has challenged and shaped me more than probably anybody else.
Yeah, I agree with that. I have not read much of Eugene, but I read his biography this summer, and I was like, okay, that's awesome, and it's inspiring. I'm reading through the Message right now, and I'm just like, yeah, this guy is good.
Yeah.
I look at this question for me, and immediately I think of greatest of all time, and I think of influence, because I think that's, as a human, what we give success to.
Yes.
Right? But a lot of the listeners on here have listened to the Mars Hill podcast.
Yep.
And we've discussed it much, Kyle, and we know that that's a bad standard to give to people as why we would follow them as a leader. So I won't discount people of influence, and I would think there is many who have been humble, such as Eugene Peterson, who God has used to influence a lot of people.
Yep.
But I have thought much about this question over the years in a sense of, I think Christians in general, myself, you, anybody who calls himself a follower of Jesus, has a commitment and a call from God to be an influence in someone else's life. That's the whole love God, love others.
Sure.
So I would say that anybody who humbly just loves even one other human being, and usually when I'm saying this, I'm meaning the person who's really hard to love in your life, who would persist through that lifelong, I would say they are the greatest of all time as a Christian.
Right.
And I would say there's no accolades for those people.
Right.
They never get.
No
one ever notices that person who has just loved that person who's hard to love day in, day out, because Christ has called them to do that.
Yeah.
I think there is more crowns in heaven for those people than there will be for Eugene Peterson. Not that Eugene won't get a lot. Yeah. But I just think in an upside down, way that God seems to do things that's different than humanity. Yeah. I think the people that we would elevate and say these people are awesome. Yeah. I think we'll be surprised as who's wearing crowns when we get to heaven.
I will completely agree with you, and I think that is part of why I see Eugene as one of those.
Totally, I
because
agree.
he's so actively, and you would have seen this reading through that book, he actively resisted being bigger than he ever was. Yeah. Or than ever he thought he should be. Yeah. So any influence that he had was actually came with him fighting against having taken that opportunity many times. And And so I listen to a lot of rap, and I love rap culture. And so there's a guy named Logic who's phenomenal, and he in my mind is one of the greatest rappers that has been. But he has a line talking about that concept where he thinks the greatest rapper of all time is probably somewhere stacking produce, like just sitting working in a grocery store or whatever, doing that. And I think that applies that much more to Christians. The ones that are, yes, the servants and of loving others and considering others better than myself and all those Christian commands are the ones that we're probably never going to hear of. So yes, the greatest of all time Christian probably is one we're all going to meet in heaven and go like, wow, look at that person. Think of like Henry Nouwen, somebody again who got influence and has become known for what he's done without having known most people not being influenced by his work directly. I think of those types of people who seem to have resisted effectiveness for the sake of character.
I would think like we'd have to mention Mother Teresa.
Yep, totally.
But then in the context that I'm speaking of, and you and I are speaking of too, Mother Teresa and all the nuns that she has represented who didn't get the accolades that she did, but have, done that sacrificially, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
Thinking of the Christians who gave their lives back in the Colosseum and stuff.
Totally, yeah.
Those people have given so much more to follow their faith and to show and display Jesus. Like you said, we'll never know the greatest until we get to heaven and we get to meet them ourselves. But in my mind, and again, probably with things like Mars Hill and all that on the back of my mind, I go, I want to look at those people who resist fame for the sake of character. And if that comes, it's a result of the fruit of the goodness of their life as they pursue Jesus, not as they sought a platform. Yeah. So that's what I love in Eugene.
I'm not disagreeing with Eugene because I definitely got that as I read that biography. I was like, wow, this is a different human being. This is a different Christian, right? I think this is going to sound really weird and I'm probably going to get flack for it, but I will separate myself from being a pastor at this church right now. Yeah. And I'll say Doug is probably one of, if not my best friend, and has been for 20 some years. Yeah. And I would say that the way that Doug has loved me, he would be someone that I would say great Christian. Yeah. Like if I wanted to model my life after somebody, which I have, because that's why he's my friend, I would say Doug's one of those guys. Yeah. And I would hope that, again, okay, so he's the pastor, Blake, and you're no. I would hope that all of our listeners have someone in their life who is like that ahead of them. Yep. Someone who's a friend of theirs or a mentor of theirs that is just acting as a mini Christ ahead of them. Yep. That may never get, on the list greatest of all time. Totally. But would be someone who is, leading you into the humility of Christ. Yep. Yep. Yeah. We're going to pick biblical characters because I feel like I took that off the table in my head. All right, so go back to biblical characters. I'll pick my favorite one there, and I'll go John. John? Yeah. I think John has to be my favorite New Testament author for, hands down. Really? Yeah. He is so in love with Jesus, and that comes out more than anything. Paul loves to think, and he clearly loves Jesus, but John, I just get pulled into it oh, man. You want nothing more than to have space, in every bit of space you can in your life for Jesus to be shown. That I go, I want to be like John. Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think you could make a case for a lot of biblical characters. I mentioned James this week when I did our communion. Yep. And James is that guy for me, just because I understand that he wrote the book late probably in life. So he's lived through Christianity. Yeah. And he got to be one of the heads of the church at one point. Yeah. And then says, this is what's important. Yeah. I just think pretty cool. Yeah. Oh yeah. That's part of why I like John too, right? Yeah, he's probably writing right at the end of his life. Yeah. And so he's spent 50, 70 years just reflecting on those 3.5 maybe that he had with Jesus and how much he was loved and how much he was changed by that. And then again, something I've taken from Eugene, the idea of a spiritual imagination, for John to have written Revelation clearly had scripture and the love of Jesus permeate his heart so deeply to then not just tell something as factual, but to paint this incredible image that Revelation is. He was just somebody who heart, mind, and soul was captivated by Jesus and then exhibits godlike creativity to share the message that Revelation does. Now it's been so misconstrued, but yeah, John, if I'm going biblical, John. Yeah. So. I think there's many throughout history who have done really well. I think there's many that have done very poorly. Yeah. But I would say again, find somebody that is a good mentor and
Yes.
let them pour into your life.
Yep.
Yeah.
Cool. Probably shouldn't jump into any more looking at the other questions we've got.
All right.
So we end this one early?
Sure. Well, we only have 2 more questions, so
Yeah, but both of them are long ones that will not be answered in 7 minutes.
all right. But we have to leave some for next week, is what
That's
I'm
true,
saying, in
too.
case somebody's not
That's
giving
true,
us
too.
questions. So send in your questions, you guys.
Please. Please do.
We will see you next week.
See you guys.
This has been the Living Springs Q&A podcast. If you have a question you would like answered or would like to learn more, visit us at livingspringsairdrie.com. Thanks for tuning in.